We like to feature local authors on Rhythm and Rhyme, and we have a novelist here. Jim Goddard, publishing under the name of James Goddard, has just written Knowledge Waits. Rather an unusual title for a novel, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, the novel's essentially a sort of an educational satire, hence the knowledge part in it. And the weights part is that I think you get to the end and you assume that for most of the people in the novel, whether they're the staff or the students, that knowledge isn't ever really coming along. There's not much self-knowledge on behalf of most of the teachers that are featured in the novel.
And tell us a bit about the plot.
It's basically a sort of multi-narrator thing. It's narrated by about half a dozen of the different teachers for the most part, until it gets to the end. It's all leading up to a big meeting at the end to introduce yet another new educational initiative. And for the most part, it's the different characters establishing themselves, establishing their relationships with each other, and then it finishes with this big meeting at the end, just before the end of the summer term, as I say, to launch some initiative that is clearly not going to go down well with the majority of the staff. That's the climax of the novel.
Well, it sounds rather unusual. So what gave you the idea for writing it?
I think, having worked in education for over 30 years and become more and more astounded with each passing week with how crazy the whole thing's come, it sort of stemmed from that. Part of the impetus, I guess, came from a novel I read a long time ago called As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner.
Which that's one of my favourite novels.
Is it?
Yes.
Well, that adopts a multi-narrator point of view, and I found that an interesting, difficult novel to read at first, and then eventually I did teach it some years ago, and thought, just that playing around with different voices and different points of view struck me as quite interesting. So I've adopted that for most of the novel to say, but it does turn into pretty much a sort of third-person narration by the end, when the meeting takes place.
So, is it a boys' school or a mixed school?
Yeah, it's set in a private school for boys, but very few students feature. It's nearly all about the staff. None of the pupils is given a voice. Only a handful are mentioned throughout the novel itself. So it's really the staff thing.
And when did you write Knowledge Waits?
I finished it pretty much a couple of years ago, I think. It's only been out since March, middle of March it came out. It's published by a new company called Zitebooks. It's Zite books.com, which is primarily, to start with at least, they're e-books, rather than conventional books to start with.
Mm-hmm. So that was my next question. Is it an e-book or are there physical copies about?
As yet, there are no physical copies. Hopefully, if it sells enough, there may be. But, I mean, obviously that's a matter that's ongoing for discussion. Mm-hmm. But at the moment, it is just an e-book. And say it's been out a month and it's sold quite a few. So I'm just hoping perhaps to sell a few more.
And have you written any other books?
No, I've written odd things at various times, odd sketches, odd poems, odd little plays and things. I have started a second one, but I've as yet not got too far. And I'm not even sure that's worth continuing with, but there will be a second, I'm sure.
So we have a first novelist in our midst.
Yeah, albeit at a rather ripe old age. I thought I wanted to get it out before I was 60, and I missed that deadline by about 6 weeks, but never mind. Better to have it out now than never at all.
And how's it going? How well is it being received?
It seems to be okay. I mean, it's available from Amazon. That's the only place you can get it from. So you can download the app and you can read it on any device pretty much. When I left home today, there were about 17 reviews on there, and they're all pretty good. So I'm just, hoping that it carries on getting that good reception.
And could we have an extract from this book now, please?
Yeah, this comes from a part that's narrated by somebody called Chris Adams, who's the biology teacher at the school, and it's probably 2/3 of the way through the novel. To set the scene, he's just had one of his lessons watched by an external inspector, not an Ofsted inspector, but a sort of an agency inspector. And this briefly follows the conversation that takes place between them afterwards. Clearly the inspector hasn't liked the lesson. After class, however, the pseudo-inspector offered me his feedback. He was a younger man who'd clearly been caught up in some of the experimental teaching of a previous decade, which had since fallen out of favour, and he had not enjoyed my class. All very teacher-led, was his first utterance. When did that become a bad thing? My efforts to tell him that I felt the points I put on the screen needed a gloss for the pupil's benefit seemed only to perplex and annoy him in equal measure. I feel you missed an opportunity there, he wheedled. far better for kinesthetic learners if you'd allowed the boys to discuss in pairs the exam board's advice in order that they might make meaning for themselves on ways to improve their grades. Did the fool not appreciate that the very density of the language provided by the exam board precluded the boys making too much sense of it all? I told him so. Never underestimate the potential children have to learn in a constructive way from each other, was his trite and parroted rejoinder. After all, education's a process of mastering new concepts along the road of the educational journey. They would have worked out for themselves some of the more difficult terms. I could not resist. Tu crois que c'est possible de comprendre les idées difficiles, même quand on ne comprend pas les mots utilisés par l'auteur? I'd guessed correctly. He knew no French. I beg your pardon? My point exactly, I beamed. Without a clear knowledge and understanding of the lexis used, any comprehension of new ideas and concepts can never be anything more than rudimentary, a series of unlikely guesses at best and complete non-understanding at worst. He felt a fool, and was undeniably more than a little riled.
And thank you very much there to Jim Goddard. And you can get Knowledge Weights by James Goddard from Amazon.